Imagine you're about to start dating someone and your friend says, look, I know something about this person that you probably should know, but I don't want to gossip. And honestly, I don't think any of us would say, no, please protect their privacy. I would rather find out a hard way. You would want to know. Of course you would want to know. Suddenly, gossip doesn't feel shallow anymore because now it might save you from wasting 6 months of your life or getting humiliated or just walking into a situation everyone else already understands except you. And I kept thinking about that because we all claim to hate gossip. I mean, people say it all the time. I hate drama. I don't talk about people. I stay out of it. And usually they say this right before telling you something absolutely devastating about someone who is not in the room. Which is funny because apparently gossip is one of the things that everyone condemns and almost everyone participates in. But we only call it gossip when we dislike the person doing it. When we do it, it becomes concern, a context, a warning, an explanation, or I'm only telling you because I trust you. And I'm not even saying that in a judgmental way because I do it too. I've had conversations where someone tells me a story about another person and I immediately start rearranging everything I thought I knew about them. Suddenly, a note interaction makes sense. A strange comment becomes suspicious. Their personality starts looking different, and none of this based on something I personally witnessed. It is based on a story told by one person about another person while that person is absent and cannot correct anything. That is an extraordinary amount of power for something we treat as meaningless chatter. Because for most of human history, this was basically how you learned who could be trusted. There were no background checks, no online reviews, no searchable court records, no screenshots, no way to quietly investigate someone before letting them into your life. You had other people. You had neighbors, relatives, merchants, servants, friends, enemies, people who had heard something from someone who had heard something from someone else. Your reputation did not belong to you. It lived in other people's memories and traveled through their conversations. And this is where gossip becomes much stranger than celebrity news or people being bored at work because it starts looking less like a bad habit and more like an old social technology. A messy, unreliable, sometimes cruel technology, obviously, but still a technology for answering one of the most important questions in any human group. What kind of person is this when I'm not there to watch them? Welcome, I'm Angelina. That may be why gossip feels so irresistible. It gives us the feeling that we are seen behind the performance, behind what someone wants us to see. But of course, that raises another problem because the moment we start using gossip to discover who people really are, we also have to ask who gets to tell the story first. For most of history, you could lose your livelihood, your marriage prospects, your place in the community, sometimes even your freedom, because a few people in your village had started telling the same story about you. And the unsettling part is that they didn't necessarily have to prove it. I mean, today, when we hear the word gossip, we imagine something relatively harmless. Someone has an affair, somebody behaves badly at a party, a colleague says something embarrassing, and by lunchtime the entire office knows. It can be cruel, obviously, but most of the time we still think of it as separate from the serious structures of society. The law is over here, gossip is over there. In a medieval village, that separation was much less clear. Most people lived in communities where almost everybody knew almost everybody else, or at least knew the family, the occupation, the debts, the old arguments, who had married whom, and why their marriage was apparently a terrible idea. Privacy in the modern sense was very limited. Work happened around other people, religion happened around other people, family disputes escaped through thin walls, shared courtyards, servants, neighbors, markets, church doors. There are not many places for a secret to remain comfortably seated. And your survival depended on being known in the right way. A stranger arriving in a town could not show an identity card, a professional license, or a neat digital history of previous employment. People asked who knew him, who could speak for him, where had he come from, had he paid his debts, had he abandoned a wife somewhere else, which honestly seems to have been a surprisingly common concern. So the community worked almost like a human archive. Information was stored in people, and gossip was one of the ways that archive was constantly updated. This became especially dangerous when suspicion attached itself to someone already vulnerable. Historians of European witch trials have shown that accusations often did not begin with one dramatic event. They could grow slowly out of years of local tension, an argument between neighbors, a refused request for food, an animal becoming sick, a child dying, someone muttering something unpleasant at exactly the wrong moment. Then an older story would be remembered and another person would add something, and suddenly unrelated misfortunes began to look like a pattern. Which is, I think, one of the frightening things about gossip. It doesn't only transmit stories, it can organize memories. Once people decide what kind of person you are, all events start rearranging themselves around that decision. A strange law becomes evidence. A quarrel becomes a warning sign. Bad luck becomes suspicious. And I have noticed this even in completely ordinary situations now. Someone tells you that a person is manipulative, and from that point on, every pause, every compliment, every nice gesture begins to look calculated. Maybe the warning is correct. Sometimes it absolutely is, but you're no longer observing that person neutrally. You're observing them through a story someone else has already given you. In a small community where you could not simply move away, change your name and create a new account, that story could follow you for decades. So gossip wasn't merely how people passed time, it helped communities decide who belonged, who could be trusted, and who should be watched. But villages were not the only places governed by other people's talk. Long before medieval, neighbors were building cases out of sick cows and old arguments. The political elite of Rome had already learned how useful a private scandal could be. In Rome, you could spend years building a political career and then watch it begin to collapse because people had become unusually interested in who attended your dinner party. Not a military defeat, not necessarily corruption, sometimes it was the guest list. And I think this is where gossip becomes much more deliberate because Roman politicians understood that attacking someone else's policies was useful, obviously, but attacking their character could be even better. If you could convince people that a man was sexually undisciplined, controlled by women, addicted to luxury, cruel inside his own household, or simply incapable of behaving like a respectable Roman, then his private life started to look like evidence that he should not be trusted with public power. The Romans did not really have our clean separation between personal and political life. A statesman was expected to govern himself before he could govern anyone else, which sounds reasonable until you realize how much material this gave his enemies. Cicero, for example, was very good at this, almost disturbingly good. When he attacked Mark Antony in the Philippics, he did not limit himself to political decisions. He talked about drinking, debt, sexual behavior, humiliating friendships, inappropriate luxury. He brought up Antony's relationship with the actress and dancer Cytherea, presenting the whole thing as proof that Antony had abandoned Roman dignity and was moving around Italy in what was basically a traveling scandal. Now I should probably say that political speeches are not neutral biographies. Cicero was trying to destroy him. He exaggerated, selected details, probably repeated rumors he found useful and ignored anything that did not fit the picture. But that is almost the point. The audience did not need every accusation to be firmly proven for the portrait to work. They just needed enough details to start imagining Antony as a certain kind of man. And once that image exists, everything he does begins to confirm it, which actually is very similar to what we were talking about with the medieval village, except Roman political gossip could travel much further. Rome was full of overlapping information networks. Senators exchanged letters. Travelers carried news between cities. Merchants heard things in ports and marketplaces. Soldiers brought stories from military camps. Enslaved people and servants moved constantly through elite households where they could overhear conversations that powerful men probably assumed were private. Historian Cristina Rizzillo Lopez has written about how political information in the Roman Republic traveled through informal conversations as much as through official speeches. People discussed elections, wars, alliances, and scandals in the forum, in shops, during dinners, and at the baths. So when we picture Roman politics only as men in white togas debating inside grand buildings, we're missing the much noisier part of the system. Politics also happened while people were getting dressed, eating, bathing, and asking whether anyone else had heard what Antony apparently did last night. And the Romans understood this so well that Virgil turned rumor into a creature in the Aeneid, Fama covered with eyes, ears, and mouth moving faster as she spreads, carrying truth and falsehood together because, honestly, why would a rumor stop to fact check itself? But there's something else here that I kept noticing. Men like Cicero used gossip very openly, and yet the people most associated with gossip in later European culture were not powerful politicians. They were women, and that shit was not accidental. It's kind of strange, isn't it? We have spent the last few minutes talking about Roman senators, medieval courts, political speeches, legal investigations, witch trials, and yet if you say the word gossip, I think most people immediately picture two women talking over coffee. I certainly do, which is funny because historically that stereotype doesn't really make much sense. Roman politics was overflowing with gossip. Medieval courts relied on local reputation. Kings, bishops, merchants, diplomats, they all depended on information about people who weren't in the room. Men were spreading stories about other men constantly. So somewhere along the way, gossip stopped looking like something people did and started looking like something women did. I got curious about that because it felt too convenient. And it turns out that the history of the word itself is incredibly weird. In Old English, gossip had absolutely nothing to do with rumors. Literally. The word meant something much closer to a godparent or a close spiritual companion. Over time, it also came to describe women who support each other during childbirth, which makes sense if you think about it. Childbirth wasn't a private hospital experience. It was usually a room full of female relatives, neighbors, and close friends who stayed together for hours, sometimes days. And, well, people talked about births, about husbands, about neighbors, about marriages, about who had done what last week. It wasn't some official institution. It was just one of the few spaces where women could spend long periods together without men directing the conversation. Historians like Bernard Kapp argue that these female social networks became incredibly important in early modern England. Women exchanged practical information, shared advice, lent money, looked after each other's children, helped during illness, and yes, discussed other people's lives. Those conversations created trust. They also created influence. And influence has a habit of making powerful people uncomfortable. By the 16th and 17th centuries, you can actually see authorities becoming increasingly suspicious of what they called idle women's talk. Church records, court documents, and moral pamphlets started describing women as noisy, disorderly, and capable of controlling their tongues. Not because women had suddenly discovered gossip, because people had started seeing female conversation itself as something potentially dangerous. One punishment from England always sticks in my head. It was called the scold's bridle. Imagine a metal cage locked around a woman's head with an iron plate forced into her mouth so she physically couldn't speak. Some versions even had a sharp spike pressing against the tongue so that trying to talk became painful. And yes, this was real punishment. Usually for women described as quarrelsome, disruptive, or excessively talkative. Now obviously not every woman who liked chatting ended up wearing one of these. They were relatively common, but the fact that such a device existed at all tells you something about the culture. People weren't simply trying to stop lies. Sometimes they were trying to control who was allowed to shape public opinion. And honestly, the more I read about this period, the less gossip looked like meaningless conversation. It started looking like a struggle over who gets to control someone else's reputation. The more history I read, the more one question kept bothering me. If gossip has ruined reputations, started political scandals, fueled witch trials, and even inspired actual torture devices, why did every single society keep doing it? Seriously. At some point, I realized I had probably been asking the wrong question this entire time. I kept looking for the moment gossip appeared in history. But what if it didn't? What if gossip is actually older than history itself? That sounded ridiculous when I first came across it. Then, I started reading Robin Dunbar. Dunbar is probably best known for something called Dunbar's number. The idea that humans can only maintain around 150 stable social relationships. But while reading his work, I found another argument that honestly fascinated me even more. I actually talked about Dunbar's number in much more detail in another video, so I'll leave that up here if you want the full explanation. But the part of his work that matters here is slightly different. According to Dunbar, language may not have evolved primarily so we could discuss philosophy, compose poetry, or negotiate trade. It may have evolved because we desperately needed a better way to maintain friendships. That sounds almost insulting to human intelligence, until you compare us with other primates. Chimpanzees spend enormous amount of time grooming each other. They pick through each other's furs, remove dirt and parasitize, scratch places they're impossible to reach alone. It looks like hygiene. It isn't. Or at least it isn't only hygiene. Primatologists have shown for decades that grooming is one of the main ways apes build trust, repair relationships, and strengthen alliances. If two chimpanzees spend a long time grooming each other, they're more likely to cooperate later, share food, offer protection, back each other up during conflicts. In other words, grooming is social glue. The problem is that grooming doesn't scale. If your group has 20 members, you can probably keep up. If your group has 50, 100, 150, you would have to spend almost entire days scratching everyone else's back. And that's where Dunbar proposed something extraordinary. Language became vocal grooming. Instead of strengthening one relationship at a time through touch, humans discovered that they could strengthen several relationships simultaneously simply by talking together. And what did they talk about? Not quantum physics, not tax policy, other people. Because other people are what every member of the group already cares about. Who can be trusted, who had a child, who helped someone, who cheated, who is sick, who is looking for a hunting partner, who owes whom a favor. And honestly, that's where everything clicked for me. I had been treating gossip like this annoying habit humans never managed to get rid of. But what if it's backwards? What if talking about other people was one of the things that made large human societies possible in the first place? It's one of the reasons humans are able to build groups so much larger than any other primate. And that completely changed the way I looked at the rest of the evidence. So naturally, I started wondering, if gossip really helped humans build larger societies, why does it still feel so irresistible today? I mean, think about it. Imagine someone walks up to you and says, "I need to tell you something about Sarah." Most people don't respond with, "No, thanks. I'd rather hear about tax regulations." Your brain immediately pays attention. And apparently, that's completely normal. One study after another keeps finding roughly the same thing. A surprisingly large share of our everyday conversations revolve around other people. Depending on how you define gossip, the estimates vary, but they're usually somewhere around 60 to 70%. When I first read that, I thought, no way. Then I started paying attention to my own conversations. Family, friends, classmates, co-workers, even strangers. Almost every conversation eventually drifts towards someone who isn't in the room, not because we're trying to destroy their reputation, usually because we're just updating each other. Oh, they moved. They got married. They quit. They started dating. They finally graduated. It's less like spreading secrets and more like maintaining a shared map of the people around us. And that's another thing I didn't expect. Most gossip isn't actually negative. Psychologists have been pointing this out for years. When researchers record everyday conversations, they find that a huge amount of gossip is completely neutral. It's just information. Who knows whom, who works where, who can be trusted, who probably can't. Basically, our brains are constantly updating a social database, which if you think about it, makes perfect sense. Imagine meeting someone you have never seen before. You could spend years figuring out whether they are reliable, or you could ask someone who already knows them. That's incredibly valuable information. In evolutionary terms, it saves time. Sometimes it even saves your life. So maybe we have been misunderstanding gossip this whole time. We tend to think of it as pointless noise, but for most of human history, it was information. Information that helped people decide who to trust, who to avoid, and who they could rely on when things went wrong. And honestly, when you look at it that way, it's not really that surprising we never stopped doing. Except that's only half the story. Because if gossip really was this useful, why does it have such a terrible reputation? Why do we almost never use the word as a compliment? Well, the answer seems to be that gossip works brilliantly until it doesn't. Imagine you're living in a village of 100 people. Someone steals from their neighbors. Soon everyone knows. Maybe that person loses the trust of the community. Maybe fewer people want to trade with them. Maybe nobody asks them for help anymore. It's harsh, but it's also a way for the group to protect itself. Anthropologists have found this pattern in societies all over the world. Reputation isn't just something people have, it's something communities actively maintain. And gossip is one of the cheapest ways to do it. The problem starts when information stops being information. Because gossip doesn't have a built-in fact checker. It never has. Every time a story gets repeated, someone leaves out a detail, someone exaggerates, someone remembers it differently, someone adds a tiny little assumption that slowly turns into a fact. And after enough retellings, people aren't discussing what happened anymore. They're discussing the version everyone believes happened. History is full of examples like that. A rumor spreads through a town, a family becomes suspicious, a neighbor becomes dangerous. Someone gets blamed for a bad harvest, a disease, or a crime nobody can actually explain. But at that point, gossip isn't helping people understand reality anymore. It's creating a new one. And honestly, that's probably the scariest part, because nothing about that process belongs to the past. The technology changes, the speed changes, the number of people listening changes, but the mechanism itself looks almost exactly the same. So after all of this, I don't really think gossip is the way I used to. When I started researching this video, I thought it was just one of those annoying parts of human nature. Something immature, something we should have grown out of by now. Instead, I found something much older. For most of human history, gossip wasn't just entertainment. It was how people figured out who they could trust, how communities enforced their own rules, how reputations were built, and sometimes destroyed. It helped people cooperate, it helped them survive, and occasionally it ruined innocent lives. It's done all of those things for thousands of years, which is why I don't think social media invented gossip. The internet didn't create it, it just removed the limits. For most of history, a rumor could spread across a village. Today, it can spread across the entire world before the person it's about has even opened their phone. The mechanism is almost exactly the same, the consequences aren't. And maybe that's why gossip feels so complicated. Because it isn't inherently good. It isn't inherently evil either. It's simply one of the oldest social tools we have ever had. Like almost every tool humans have ever invented. It depends on how we choose to use it. Anyway, that's what I found when I started asking, why do we gossip?